Today we are going to be looking at key squares. Square is called a key square when occupation of it by the attacking king will secure a win regardless of which side is to move. Key squares are useful mostly in endgames involving only kings and pawns, as featured here. The key squares depend on the position of the pawn and are relatively easy to determine. If we look at our example here, the key squares would be d6, e6 and f6. You can think of the key squares as the three squares, 2 rows directly in front of the pawn. There are exceptions to this if the pawn is on the 5th rank or it's a rook pawn, but we'll look more at this later. If in this position it is black to move, then white will win the game as his king can access one of the key squares. Let's show some variations. If black goes king f7, now white's next move should be obvious, king d6. As we said, we want to get our king to one of these key squares, and that will secure us victory regardless of who is to move. For example, now if black goes, let's say king e8, we can push e5, king d8. If black doesn't go king d8 and the king goes to f7, for example, we can just play king d7 and then we'll push our pawn with e6, e7 and e8. So after king d8, we can still just go e6, king e8 and e7. And after king f7, we can go king d7, and the pawn will promote. We go back to the starting position. If, let's just say black goes king d7, our next move is obvious. We want to bring our king to one of the key squares. We can go king f6. If black, let's say, tries king d8 this time, we can go e5. Slightly tricky if he goes king e8. Now, it's very important that we do not push our pawn here. If we go e6, black can just go king f8, e7, king e8, and king e6, and we'll have a draw by stalemate. So instead, advancing our pawn, we first just go king e6, we gain the opposition, and whichever side our opponent's king goes to, we'll go the other side. Now we control the queening square, and our pawn will promote, with the next 3 moves being advancing said pawn. If we go back to the starting position again, and we look at this position with white to move, this will be a draw because the white king cannot access any of the key squares if black plays correctly. Let's say king d5, black will follow king d7, again preventing access to the key squares. If you are the defending side in this position, you should always try to prevent your opponent from accessing the key squares, because then he will have guaranteed himself victory. If white goes king e5, black should just keep the opposition. King e7, again preventing access to those key squares. King f5, we continue following with king e7, king f7. And now we notice it's kind of impossible for the white king to make any progress. So let's say he tries pushing the pawn. And now we need to be a bit more accurate with black. We have a rule here for how we should defend. We must either take opposition of the king, step directly in front of the pawn, or step 2 squares in front of the pawn. So in this position, we cannot step 1 square in front of the pawn. It's illegal. We can't take opposition because it's our move. We have to move. So we will thus go king e7. Let's say white continues pushing his pawn with e6. Now again, we apply our rule. We either want to take opposition, step 1 square in front of the pawn, or step 2 squares in front of the pawn. Here, we are already 1 square in front of the pawn, so we cross that off our checklist. We can't take opposition of king f7, so we go king e8. If white continues with king f6, now we are already 2 squares in front of the pawn, so we cross that off our checklist. We cannot step 1 square in front of the pawn because the white king controls it. So thus, we must go king f8 and take opposition. If white continues with e7, we can then go king e8 and then king e6, and we'll get stalemate. It's very important to remember the correct way to defend this position. Again, we always want to either step 1 square in front of the pawn, 2 squares in front of the pawn, or take opposition. If we don't do that, we can easily end up in trouble. As I mentioned at the start of the video, there are exceptions to the key squares rule. Those exceptions being if the pawn is on the 5th rank or a rook pawn. Here we see an example of a pawn being on the 5th rank. The difference here is that the key squares change. Not only is it d7, e7, and f7, as for the other pawns, it is also the square's one row in front of the pawn. So here d6, e6, and f6. So this position is a win for white regardless of who is to move. And it's quite simple. We just go king f6. Let's say black goes king f8. We go e6, king e8, e7, king d7, and then king f7. And it's always going to be winning, providing our king can get access to one of these 6 key squares. A lot of people try to evaluate king and pawn endings based on opposition. However, this is one way that can often confuse people, which is why we use the key squares method instead. Let's take a look now at a rook pawn. Rook pawn's key squares do not apply too much, because the problem is for a rook's pawn it's impossible to chase the opponent's king off the file. So if the black king, the defending king, can stand on any of the squares on the file of our pawn, it'll be a draw. For example, if we go h4, king g7, king g5, king h7, h5, king g7, h6, king h7, king h5, king h8, king g6. I have gone through these moves quite quickly because there's a lot of moves that could be played, but they're all going to end the same way. King g8, h7, king h8, and king h6. And we have our standard stalemate technique. It is also important to note, even if white, for example, had a white squared bishop, it would still be a draw. You could put the white squared bishop anywhere on the board, and we would still be unable to chase the black king out of the corner. Okay, this is going to be our first exercise here. If you want to pause the video, spend some time thinking about it. First thing we should do is we should evaluate which the key squares are. Now remember, the key squares are the 3 squares 2 rows in front of the pawn. So in this position, that would be a6, b6, and c6. We would like to get our king to one of those squares. If we try to centralize our king, king d2, a lot of players were taught to centralize your king in the endgame. So if we just continue naturally, king d2, king e7, king d3, king d6, king d4, king c6, king c4, king b6. And you'll notice our king has failed to reach one of the key squares. If we try something like king d5 here, black can just go king b5, and he will capture our pawn. So let's go back to the starting position. The correct approach here is to find the square furthest away from the black king. In this case, that would be a6. So we just play king c2. After king e7, king b3, king d6, king a4, king c6, king a5. Black goes king b7. And now white can just go king b5, taking opposition. And whichever side black goes, we'll just move our king to the other side, and we'll have gained control of one of the key squares. And as we saw in the previous examples, we would thus be winning. Here is another example. This actually happened in a Grandmaster game. In this position, white played rook f4. And now I want you to try to find a way black can win this game. You're welcome to pause the video, spend some time thinking about it. If black captures this rook and white captures back on f4, it'll be a draw. There is no way for the black king to reach the 3 key squares. Right? So I think that is what the player playing white saw in the game. However, unfortunately, king g5 was overlooked. Now, rook takes f5 is forced, black can play king takes f5, and it is impossible for white to prevent black from having access to one of the key squares. I hope you guys found this video helpful. I'll see you next time.